They called them the D-Day Dodgers. The men who fought their way up the Italian peninsula, through sweltering heat and freezing mountain passes, through minefields and rubble-choked streets, were mocked by some back home as shirkers, soldiers who'd somehow ducked the real fight in France. The truth couldn't be more different. In September 1943, over 100,000 Allied troops launched an assault on Hitler's so-called Fortress Europe, not on the beaches of Normandy, but here, on the shores of Italy. What followed was one of the most brutal, unforgiving campaigns of the entire Second World War. A campaign fought across impossible terrain, against a determined and brilliant enemy, in conditions that pushed men to their absolute breaking point. This is the story of the Allied invasion of Italy, and it begins with a crossing so easy it almost felt like a trap. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, weapons, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. September 3rd, 1943. The 4th anniversary of Britain entering the war. At 3:45 in the morning, the sky above the Straits of Messina erupted. 630 guns opened fire from the Sicilian shore, hammering the Italian coastline around the port city of Reggio, Calabria. It was the opening salvo of Operation Baytown, the first Allied landing on the European mainland. Leading the charge was General Bernard Montgomery and his legendary British Eighth Army. Monte, fresh from his victories in North Africa and Sicily, and was now going to carry the fight to the enemy's doorstep. Behind him, 268 landing craft churned across the narrow strait. Among the first wave was Captain David Cole of the 2nd Inniskilling Fusiliers. As his landing craft ground onto the beach, Cole braced for the worst. Machine gun fire, mortars, carnage. The ramp dropped. He charged out and heard nothing. Silence. Total, bewildering silence. Then, from somewhere in the ruins of Reggio, voices rang out, "Viva Inglese!" After years of brutal fighting across North Africa and Sicily, these men were being welcomed as liberators. It was almost too good to be true. And it was. By 9 a.m., things were going so well that Montgomery himself was able to land in Reggio. He found the city in ruins, pulverized first by Allied bombers, then by those 630 guns firing across the straits. In retrospect, all that firepower had been massive overkill for a landing that met almost no opposition. But Monte only had enough shipping for 2 divisions, and he wanted to make absolutely certain. Poor Reggio paid the price. But the easy landing masked a deeper problem. Each soldier was carrying an enormous amount of personal kit because the Allies couldn't get enough vehicles across in the first waves. Normally, a division would have 3,000 vehicles. Those 268 landing craft had to beetle back and forth across the straits around the clock just to keep the buildup going. And where these men were headed, they were going to need every ounce of supplies they could carry. Because behind those beaches, the mountains were waiting. And the Aspromonte National Park rears up just miles inland, the southern tip of the Apennine chain that snakes down the entire spine of Italy. And this terrain would come to define every single day of the campaign. Now, before the invasion of Italy was even planned, various other operations had been suggested. A clearing out of Sardinia and Corsica, an invasion of Greece and the Balkans to threaten Germany's control of the Romanian oil fields. But in the end, Italy offered the most strategic value, knocking Italy out of the war, drawing German divisions away from both the Eastern Front and the Atlantic Wall where Operation Overlord was being planned, capturing the Foggia airfields for strategic bombers, and seizing the port of Naples. 4 objectives. 4 reasons to plunge into this mountainous nightmare. And the Germans had no intention of fighting on the beaches. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of the most capable commanders of the war, had a far more cunning plan. He would let the Allies land. Then he'd trap them. Kesselring had just overseen the masterful evacuation of 40,000 German troops from Sicily, right across the very same straits the Allies were now crossing. Those men hadn't vanished. They were waiting. And now, German combat engineers went to work with devastating efficiency. Every bridge was blown. Every road was blocked. Every pathway was sown with mines. Junior Officer Farley Mowat of the Canadian Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment described it perfectly. Not a bridge along the few snake-gutted highways remained undestroyed. There were mines, mines, and more mines. The Allies were in Italy, but they might as well have been on the moon. Progress slowed to a crawl, 10 miles a day at best. Men toiled uphill under a burning sun, each soldier hauling what felt like a barrow load of equipment through terrain that doubled every distance on the map. Captain Cole, who'd landed so easily that morning, reached his first objective, the village of Airfields, by late afternoon. He was drenched in sweat and deeply uneasy. He described the view as Homeric. The hazy blue mountains of Sicily on one side, the landing craft still beetling back and forth across the straits on the other. Beautiful, but also terrifying. Because he knew those 40,000 Germans were out there somewhere. And here was the real problem. The main Allied landings at Salerno were scheduled for September 9th, 6 days away and 200 miles to the north. The 8th Army was supposed to push up and support them. But look at the terrain, mountains all the way. At 10 miles a day through demolished roads and minefields, it would take weeks to cover that distance. The men at Salerno were going to be on their own. 200 miles to the north, the answer was about to become terrifyingly clear. The main event wasn't Baytown. It was Operation Avalanche, the full-scale Allied assault on the beaches of Salerno, launched on September 9th. This was the hammer blow. And the man swinging it was General Mark Clark, commanding the U.S. Fifth Army. Clark himself admitted the stakes. We may get hurt, but you can't play with fire without the risk of burning your fingers. I wasn't exaggerating. The Bay of Salerno was a defender's dream. 15 miles of beach, enframed on every side by mountains. Mountains that gave the Germans perfect observation over everything the Allies did. And Clark faced a chronic shortage of ships, which forced him to split his force in two. British troops would land in the north, near the city of Salerno. Americans would land in the south, near the ancient Greek temples of Paestum. Between them, miles of open beach and rivers. Succeed, and the Allies would have a foothold halfway to Rome. Fail, and Clark was losing an entire army. But there was something else. Kesselring had identified Salerno as a likely target. His forces were dug in and waiting. Up in the mountains, a young German officer named Lieutenant Rocholl of the 16th Panzer Division manned his observation post. Below him, German and Italian troops waited in bunker complexes, behind barbed wire and minefields. Panzer tanks roamed the plains. Kesselring's orders were simple. Defend your ground, wait for reinforcements, then destroy the invaders. Then, on the evening of September 8th, everything changed. General Eisenhower announced that Italy had surrendered. The Italian armed forces were out of the war. For the men aboard the invasion fleet, it was electric. Many thought the fight might be over before it started. But the armistice was a double-edged sword. Yes, it eliminated thousands of Italian defenders. But it also meant the Germans immediately activated Operation Axis, the swift, ruthless disarming of every Italian soldier they could reach. Rocholl himself was sent with armored cars to disarm an Italian gun position, which he did with, as he put it, shameful ease. Now Kesselring could throw every available German soldier at Salerno. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 9th, the 36th Texas Division approached the southern beaches in near-total silence. Clark had gambled on surprise, choosing not to bombard the landing zones beforehand. The ramps dropped. The Germans fired flares, and then machine gun tracers tore the beaches apart. It was carnage. The Texans had landed right on top of a reinforced German position. In other sectors, Allied troops waded ashore virtually unopposed. The armistice had created a patchwork of defended and undefended stretches. But where the Germans were waiting, the cost was terrible. By the end of September 9th, the Allies were barely clinging to their toehold. The beachhead was tiny, fragmented, and dominated by German positions in the mountains above. What followed was a week of some of the bitterest fighting that British or American soldiers had endured in the entire war. The Germans controlled the landscape. They kept the Allies pinned in pockets. They strangled reinforcement and supply lines. And while the Allies struggled, Kesselring poured in division after division. The Allies had landed against one German division. 4 days later, they faced 6. On September 13th, Kesselring launched his savage counterattack. German battle groups smashed through the gap between the Allied forces and drove straight for the coast. Mark Clark ordered every available man to the line: cooks, drivers, clerks, anyone who could hold a weapon. He walked down the front telling his men, "There mustn't be any doubt in your minds. We don't give an inch. We're here to stay." But privately, he was also planning for the unthinkable: a full evacuation. The crisis point came near the village of Ponte Bariso. 5 German battle groups, packed with armor, converged on a triangle of land between the rivers Seal and Calore, trying to ford the river and smash through the American lines. They got within a mile of 5th Army's headquarters, but the terrain betrayed them. The rivers were deep, the fording points were narrow, which canalized the German armor into dense concentrations. And 2 battalions of American 105mm field guns, 48 guns in total, were positioned on elevated ground just behind a low ridge line. The Germans couldn't see them, they couldn't hit them. But those guns could rain shells down into that kill zone all day long, and they did. Or for almost 2 days, the Allied lines were pummeled. Then, on the morning of September 15th, the German counterattack finally broke. Kesselring had thrown everything at Salerno. It wasn't enough. Lieutenant Rocholl, the young German officer who'd watched the invasion from his mountain post, was killed in the fighting that followed. Just one of thousands. The British lost around 4,000 casualties. The Americans, a similar number. The Germans, double that. At no point in the war to that date had the Allies faced such a concentration of German divisions. It had been a near-run disaster, but they had held. With Salerno secured, the Allies surged north toward 2 critical objectives: the great port city of Naples and the airfields of Foggia. Naples had already been devastated, bombed 180 times in 1943 alone, or now the Germans were systematically destroying what remained: port facilities, electricity, water systems. Colonel Walter Schall, the German commandant, imposed martial law, curfews, forced labor roundups. The city was being strangled. But the Neapolitans fought back. In late September, a spontaneous popular uprising erupted against the German occupation. It became known as the 4 Days of Naples. Ordinary men, women, and even children fought the Germans in the streets. The nobleman Filippo Caracciolo, Prince of Castagneto, walked through the carnage and described what he saw. Pools of blood, some already dark and shiny, others still fresh, staining the pavement purple. Over 500 Neapolitans died. But their revolt accomplished something extraordinary. It prevented the Germans from organizing any defense inside the city. When lead elements of the King's Dragoon Guards reached Naples on October 1st, they marched in virtually unopposed. The city was liberated, but it was a shattered shell. 1 million people now depended on the Allies for everything from bread to water. And within a fortnight, American engineers had transformed the wrecked port. 3,000 tons of supplies were being unloaded every single day. It was an astonishing logistical triumph. Meanwhile, on the other side of the peninsula, the 8th Army reached an objective that may have been the single most important reason the Allies invaded Italy in the first place: the Foggia airfields. After months in the mountains, the army emerged onto a vast flat plain, the only place in all of southern Italy where heavy 4-engine bombers could operate. From here, an Allied aircraft could reach every corner of the Third Reich. The Romanian oil fields, the Balkans, the heart of German industry. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later wrote that he could see omens of the war's end when American bombers from the 15th Air Force crossed the Alps from their Italian bases. And here's the astonishing part. The British took Foggia on September 27th with barely a shot fired. The Germans had simply abandoned it. Hitler's confused strategy, he'd originally planned to abandon southern Italy entirely, meant that while there were plenty of German troops in Italy, they were all in the north, not here. It was, as one historian put it, one of the great own goals of the war. But the campaign was about to enter its darkest chapter. As autumn turned to winter, the Allies pushed north toward Rome, and Allied planners were desperate to seize the city before Christmas. They already controlled almost a third of Italy. Surely the push to Rome would be just as fast. A pincer strategy was devised. The Fifth Army would drive up the west coast through the Liri Valley, while the Eighth Army would advance on the east coast toward Pescara, from where a highway cut across to Rome. They didn't know it, but they were heading into one of the worst winters in living memory. And Kesselring had prepared a masterpiece of defensive engineering. He ordered a series of fortified lines stretching coast to coast across the full width of Italy. First came the Volturno line and the Barbara line. These were designed not to hold forever, but to bleed the Allies and buy time. Behind them lay the immense Bernhard and Gustav lines, or strategic demolitions everywhere, minefields at every approach, kill zones canalized by the rugged terrain. Infantry would be funneled into prepared positions where German machine guns and artillery had already registered every approach. Italy was being turned from a fortress into a meat grinder. Hitler's directive was absolute, not one step back. On the eastern coast, the Eighth Army slogged forward. The numbers tell the story, 40 miles in over a month. That sounds pitiful until you understand what they were up against. In a narrow, mountainous country like Italy, rivers cut across your line of advance constantly. Every mountain valley means another swollen crossing. Then add the Germans, offering determined defense at every ridge. Then add the weather. Sheets of rain turning every road to mud. Or then add the sheer weight of an army on the move. These roads were never designed for vast numbers of trucks, tanks, and artillery pieces. They simply disintegrated. The Eighth Army took enormous criticism for being slow. But it wasn't anyone's fault. It was the brutal reality of fighting across terrain that gave every advantage to the defender. And in the middle of all this, in remote villages with no strategic importance whatsoever, the war still had to be fought. Every hilltop hamlet had to be checked and cleared. Farley Mowat and his hasty peas reached the tiny village of Rapalla Masani on October 16th. Not a German in sight. They were hailed as liberators and given spumante. But just a few miles away, his friend Jerry Squirrel was leading a carrier platoon into San Stefano when they were ambushed. Squirrel was killed instantly, he's along with 7 of his men. Mowat wrote home about it later. He was fresh out of college, and before he knew what in hell it was all about, he ended up a pile of perforated meat. Why him? Why them? And when will it be you? That's the sort of question you ask yourself. The sheer relentlessness of it was crushing. The random cruelty. The knowledge that the next village, the next ridge, the next river crossing could be your last. And then came Ortona. Before the war, Ortona was an unremarkable coastal town of about 10,000 people. Its narrow streets were bypassed by history. But in December 1943, the full shock of war descended on it. The infantrymen of this campaign were known by a grim nickname, the PBI, the Poor Bloody Infantry. And nowhere was that name more fitting than here. The job of taking Ortona fell to the Canadian 1st Division. But first they had to cross the Moro River Valley. And that alone became a nightmare. General Vokes, the division commander, planned a silent attack on the night of December 5th. No artillery barrage. 3 battalions, about 800 men, would cross under cover of darkness. The Princess Patricias would attack Villa Rogati. The Seaforth Highlanders would take San Leonardo, and Farley Mowat's Hasty Peas would secure the coast road. Mowat was immediately sent to reconnoiter a crossing point over the Moro. He crept down into the valley, fear absolutely tearing him apart. He'd seen too much action since Sicily. It was starting to get on top of him. What we'd call combat fatigue today. But he found a crossing, and the attack went in. What followed was 2 weeks of savage fighting, Sonid attack and counterattack, up and down the steep valley walls. The terrain became a churned wasteland of shattered vineyards and bloated corpses. It was nearly impossible to recover the dead until after each engagement was over. Then came the town itself. The 1,800 German defenders had orders to hold at all costs. The streets were zeroed by snipers and machine guns. Rubble blocked the only road wide enough for tanks. When Canadian Shermans tried to push through, they hit the debris and stalled, and the Germans leapt out and hit them with Panzerfausts. The Canadians, who hadn't been trained in urban warfare, had to learn on the job. What they invented was a technique called mouse-holing. You don't go down the street. You go through the buildings, smash down a door. Engineers blow a hole in the wall to the next building. In the smoke, you fire your submachine gun, spray the room, charge in, clear every floor top to bottom, then do it again. And again, house by house, room by room. There are no shortcuts. Christmas Day. 1943 came and went with no break in the fighting. By then, the German defenders were down to the bone. Obergefreiter Gottfried Behr's battalion had started with 900 men. They were now down to 60. On the night of December 27th, the last Germans slipped out of Ortona in the dark. Behr wrote in his diary, "In the middle of the night, in single file, we leave Ortona heading north, stumbling on the slope of a vineyard, almost in the direction of the homeland." The Canadians had lost nearly 2,500 killed and wounded. Another 5,000 were pulled from the line due to illness and exhaustion. The press called it the Little Stalingrad. By the end of 1943, the Eighth Army had completely shot its bolt. It could do no more. Pescara, just 20 miles away, was a town too far. 3 months of relentless toiling up the spine of Italy. From the easy landing at Reggio to the capture of the Foggia airfields, through never-ending German demolitions, rugged mountain terrain, and the horror of Ortona, had left the army utterly spent. Attention would now turn to the western side of Italy, to the Fifth Army, and to the nightmare that awaited at Monte Cassino. But that is a story for another time. What the men of the Italian campaign had accomplished in those first 4 months was extraordinary. They had knocked Italy out of the war. They had captured the Foggia airfields, tightening the strategic noose around Nazi Germany from the air. They had liberated Naples, the largest city freed by the Allies to date, and its port was already feeding the war effort. And they had tied down dozens of German divisions that could not be sent to fight the Soviets on the Eastern Front or to reinforce the Atlantic Wall against the coming invasion at Normandy. Every day the Germans spent fighting in Italy was a day they were not preparing for D-Day. And the men who made that possible had done it across some of the most punishing terrain on Earth, in conditions that stripped away every advantage of Allied material superiority against an enemy fighting with the skill and desperation of men defending a continent. They fought in sweltering heat and freezing rain. They waded across swollen rivers and cleared minefields with their bare hands. They mouse-holed through shattered buildings and buried their friends in foreign soil. They asked themselves the same question every day. Why him? Why them? When will it be me? And still they kept going. Ridge after ridge, river after river, village after village. They called them the D-Day Dodgers, the men who crossed the Straits of Messina and landed at Reggio, the men who stormed the beaches at Salerno and held on by their fingernails, the men who liberated Naples and took Foggia without a shot, The men who mouse-holed their way through Ortona, room by bloody room over Christmas, in the cold, in the dark. They weren't dodging anything. They were fighting and dying in a campaign the world chose to forget. They deserved better than that name. They deserved to be remembered. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.